Okay, we are gathering today for a webinar with Dan Moriarty. Welcome, hello everyone. Again, my name is Susan Gunn. I'm the director of the Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns, and I'm here with my colleague, Dan Moriarty. He and I are coming to you today from our respective homes in Washington, D.C. We are working from home still during the pandemic, but while doing that, for the Office for Global Concerns, we represent all three branches of the Maryknoll mission. That is the Maryknoll Sisters, the Fathers and Brothers, the lay missioners, and we work closely with the Maryknoll affiliates. Our job is to bring the Maryknoll mission experience to important debates about public policy at the UN, on Capitol Hill, to the World Bank, IMF, and the corporate world. And always our mission is to promote peace, social justice, and integrity of creation. Dan and I and the rest of our staff work on this through education, advocacy, and action. You know, in just recent weeks, Dan and I have written letters to, and we've joined virtual meetings with members of Congress. We've led public witness in Washington, D.C. and virtually as well. And today we offer some education, and this time about human rights. So I'm so excited to have Dan present to us today because he really is the leading thinker on human rights concerns for Maryknoll. I want to tell you a little about Dan before we get started. Dan's many years of mission with Maryknoll started in Bolivia. His education in international peace studies with the Kroc Institute at the University of Notre Dame, and now his work with the Maryknoll Office in Washington as our Sustainable Pathways to Peace Coordinator. All of this makes Dan just the right person to strengthen the voice of the Catholic community in the debate on the current state of human rights in US policy and around the world. Also, while Dan talks to us, I want to invite you all to write any questions you have in the Zoom Q&A. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can write questions in the chat there. And with that, I want to turn it over to you, Dan.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, I've got some slides here, so let me just share my screen and we'll get going. Thanks. Okay, thank you. Now, what I have in mind here is kind of an overview of some of the main human rights issues we're working on today and some of the challenges they present. But I also want to talk to you a bit about a dear friend of mine and a champion of human rights who died on February 19th. Ursuline's sister, Dianna Ortiz. I'll be discussing some of the ways her life informs and inspires our work. Now, I'll be covering a whole lot of stuff here in a short time in the webinar, so I encourage you to read more about Dianna later and about the various issues we'll be touching on. Right now, though, let me share a bit about my friend Dianna. Dianna was from New Mexico, and before she finished school, she joined the Ursuline Sisters of Mount St. Joseph in Kentucky. In 1989, while working as a missioner and kindergarten teacher in Guatemala, she was kidnapped by the Guatemalan military, raped, and tortured. She survived unfathomable violence and trauma. You can read her own account of her ordeal in her book, The Blindfold's Eye, My Journey from Torture to Truth. It's available from Maryknoll's publishing branch, Orbis Books. Dianna escaped her captors and returned to the United States, severely traumatized. In the years following her abduction, Dianna healed, but she did more than that. She spoke truth to power. She shook the pillars of empire and inspired people around the world. She held a 5-week hunger strike and vigil in front of the White House, demanding the release of documents on U.S. involvement in her abduction and other human rights abuses in Guatemala. She won a groundbreaking civil suit against the Guatemalan Minister of Defense, striking a major blow against the impunity that so often protects human rights abusers. But she was always driven, first and foremost, by her concern for the Guatemalan victims of torture whose names she would never know. Dianna spoke truth to power, but she also ministered to other survivors of torture from around the world and worked to promote peace and nonviolence. She founded and directed Task International, the Torture Abolition and Survivor Support Coalition. She ran the Education for Justice program of the Center of Concern. It's now part of the Ignatian Solidarity Network. She worked with Pax Christi USA, advocating on issues from racial justice to nuclear disarmament. The victims and survivors of violence were always at the heart of her work. Just a few weeks after Dianna died, the iconographer and artist, Father Bill Nichols, shared this image of Dianna. It is beautiful, but it was jarring to see a friend portrayed in such an exalted way. With time, I'm sure I'll embrace it, though, because I actually do think Dianna Ortiz is a saint. Robert Ellsberg, the publisher of Orbis Books, is one of today's great writers on saints and sainthood. He gave a wonderful lecture a few days ago, hosted by Fairfield University and Commonweal Magazine, about his writing. You can find it on YouTube, and in it, he talks about the qualities that make someone a saint. And he shares this quote from Simone Weil. Today, it is not enough merely to be a saint, but we must have the saintliness demanded by the present moment, a new saintliness. I think Dianna exemplified that saintliness. I knew who Dianna was for a long time before I got to know her personally, but I was aware only of her pain and her trauma, and quite frankly, they frightened me a bit. But when my family moved into a CC community, the intentional community in Washington, D.C., where Dianna had lived for many years, I was surprised to discover something else: joy. My wife, Rocio, is very close to Dianna. They did crafts and gardening together. Dianna and I bonded over a shared love of strong coffee and spicy foods. Our teenage sons played and laughed with her. Yes, we also talked about her trauma and her work for justice and human rights, for peace with torture survivors. We prayed together. We went to vigils and demonstrations. There were weightier moments, but while her pain and her witness were real, so was her joy. And by joy, I mean something deeper than mere happiness. A person can be joyful and still experience sorrow. Joy is a kind of deep, enduring reserve that springs from the place where our lives touch the divine. You cultivate joy, and Dianna worked painstakingly to cultivate it, putting back together the shattered pieces of herself. She never denied or escaped her wounds. Trauma and survivor's guilt were always there, but she did survive and showed love to be more powerful than hate, nonviolence stronger than violence, faith greater than despair, by finding and sharing joy. Before she died, Dianna told friends that she was ready to go home to God, and that God is mercy. She repeated that several times. God is mercy. I can think of no greater testament to God's mercy than Dianna's joy. Dianna is an uncommon kind of saint because in many ways she was a martyr, undergoing the cross and tomb of the Guatemalan torture chambers. But she also survived. So unlike most martyrs, she began to live the resurrection here on earth. And at the same time, she continued to carry her cross. Every time she shared her story or sat with another survivor and listened to theirs, it devastated her. She was traumatized again and again. I can hardly begin to imagine the strength it took. But she did it because she believed in the power of the truth. And somehow by lifting up the truth and allowing herself to be guided by love, she found healing and, yes, joy. She wrestled with God many times. How could she not? She was very honest about that. But ultimately, she put her faith in the God of love and mercy. Today, I think any of us who advocate for human rights can pray for the intercession of Dianna Ortiz and be confident that we have a patron saint advocating for and with us. So what are some of the big human rights issues we're looking at today? I want to look at a few, but also some of the challenges they present for human rights advocates. It's still a moment of some transition, just past 100 days into a new presidency, and there's a lot happening in the world. I should note that human rights encompasses a broad set of issues. At the Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns, we generally work on just that, global, international issues and foreign policy. But human rights transcends those distinctions. We released a statement recently on the conviction of Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd. And in it, we explained that people around the world are watching what's happening here. An acquittal would have been a blow to U.S. credibility and the ability of the United States to defend human rights around the world. It would have bolstered impunity, which Maryknoll missioners everywhere have identified as one of the key elements that allow human rights abuses to occur. We affirm the jury's decision to hold one officer to account, but there's so much more to do, beginning with the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. By the way, if you'd like to read about how Catholics can better understand these issues, check out a new Orbis book by Olga Segura, Birth of a Movement, Black Lives Matter and the Catholic Church. And another powerful Orbis book we recommend also is James Cone's landmark book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. So check those out. Maryknoll has long recognized the links between our mission work abroad and our call to engage in justice at home. Another religious sister and hero of human rights died just a few days before Dianna. Maryknoll sister Madeline Dorsey, who marched with Dr. King in Selma after establishing the first integrated hospital in St. Louis. In March in Geneva, the UN Human Rights Council adopted the third Universal Periodic Review of Human Rights in the United States. This is a process every UN member country goes through every 4.5 years, in which all other countries evaluate the human rights situation in the country under review and make recommendations for improvement. The report was compiled during the Trump administration, but it will fall to President Biden's government to respond to the 347 recommendations in the report. A lot of these point to the importance of international multilateral organizations and agreements for protecting human rights. Well over 100 of the recommendations urge the U.S. to commit more fully to international agreements and multilateral institutions. President Biden has expressed a general interest in re-engaging with the global community, but it's not clear yet how many of the specific recommendations he may eventually follow. The bulk of the recommendations in the periodic review report focus on human rights abuses carried out by the United States. From closing the prison at Guantanamo to addressing racism and violence in our criminal justice system, from abolishing the death penalty to better protecting immigrants, women, and other vulnerable groups, it's clear that the global community is watching closely and expects the U.S. to live up to the same values at home that we preach abroad. I mentioned closing the prison camp at Guantanamo Bay. This is something we and many in the faith community have been pushing for many years. President Bush expressed an interest in seeing it closed, and President Obama promised to close it, but failed to get it done. Admittedly, it wasn't all his fault. There were legal and international challenges in finding places to send the inmates, and most of all, he met with powerful opposition from Congress. But 40 inmates are still there, many of them never having been formally charged with or tried for any crime. It must be closed. President Biden understands all that and has also expressed an intention to close it. 24 senators have written him a letter demanding that it be closed. Now their colleagues need to hear from us. It's time. It's past time. For another major area of human rights concerns around the world, I actually interviewed a colleague. So I've brought in my colleague, Chloe Noel, who coordinates our Faith Economy Ecology program, because I think she can speak to some of the major disturbing trends in human rights globally right now, which is that a lot of the people we see being attacked with having their human rights abused are environmental activists. We hear the phrases land defenders, water defenders. So Chloe, who are these people and why are they under attack?
Yeah, oftentimes they're people who depend on their ecosystems, that live in their ecosystems. We all, have a relationship with the place where we live, whether that's a city or a forest. And in this case, oftentimes it's indigenous leaders and communities. It's Afro-descendant communities and river-dwelling communities in the Amazon. It's Maasai pastoralists that are in East Africa. It's fishing communities in Cambodia and India who are facing threats to their land, their livelihoods, their culture, water quality, soil, and these are all threats that we see to human rights.
So this sounds like it's something that's happening everywhere. Are we talking mostly about traditional, what we think of traditionally as human rights abuses, torture, political persecution, arrest, and things like that, because they are standing up to these powerful interests, mining and agricultural interests? Or are we talking also about the attacks on the environment themselves as a violation of human rights? I know Pope Francis has really emphasized people as a part of creation in addition to being stewards of creation. And so I think there's maybe more openness to that in human rights and international law. How are these two aspects a part of what you're talking about?
Yes, exactly. You know, people are speaking out because their land, livelihood, culture, sacred sites are under attack. And as you mentioned, Pope Francis certainly understands how where we live is also it's a social justice and environmental justice issue. And then yes, people do face similar kinds of threats that you would if you were like a human rights defender, journalist, for instance. So it's a similar thing, but they're speaking out because of these threats to their lands and cultural rights. And maybe an additional area where they might have a different kind of response is displacement. They might actually be displaced from the land where they live.
And is this something that's happening in the United States as well as abroad?
Absolutely. You know, communities, Black and brown communities, Latino communities, Asian American communities, Indigenous communities, African American communities, oftentimes they live where coal-fired power plants are sited, or oil refineries, mining projects. You think about the Keystone XL pipeline and the struggles there that will impact the water for Indigenous communities. So absolutely, we see these same kind of violations in our own country, and the importance of protecting environmental defenders here in the United States too.
Wow, so a lot to do. What are some of the important advocacy efforts that are happening right now to help defend people who are defending the planet?
Well, one exciting initiative is the Escazú Agreement, and it's particular for Latin America, but it recognizes the rights of environmental human rights defenders and calls on the governments, on the states, to protect environmental human rights defenders. So that's a huge advancement in human rights, and it was just ratified on Earth Day. So that's very exciting news, and we look forward to holding accountable different countries when these activists are under threat. Additionally, another exciting effort on a global scale is the UN binding treaty on human rights in respect to transnational corporations. And while the US has been less engaged in this, they've either played a neutral role or in some cases a negative role on the process. It's an important initiative to give communities and activists remedy in the face of corporations that violate their rights. And it's binding, and that's better than a lot of the voluntary agreements that exist already. So that's an exciting development, and we will hope to see that come to fruition one day.
A lot to work on. Hopefully the Biden administration will be more helpful with the binding resolution. Chloe also, by the way, gave an excellent webinar recently on vaccine equity internationally, COVID-19 vaccines. So check that out, and you've got a lot that you're working on. So thank you so much for taking the time, Chloe.
Thank you, Dan.
Chloe mentioned displacement, and that brings us to another major issue for human rights advocacy today, migration. There are two main areas we address in our advocacy for the rights of migrants: the root causes of migration and the treatment of immigrants once they've arrived. Root causes of migration include many of the kinds of human rights abuses we've mentioned, but other forms of violence, such as gang and gender violence and poverty, also lead people to migrate. Then, when people arrive at our borders, asylum seekers are turned away in violation of international norms, children are put in cages and families torn apart, and hate crimes are a constant threat. Maryknoll advocates for the protection of immigrants' rights, and Maryknoll missioners accompany immigrants and provide legal aid and other assistance at the border. But we also advocate for foreign aid, peace-building programs, environmental protection, and human rights in other countries, so that people can feel safe in their own communities of origin. Oh, and it wouldn't be a webinar in 2021 without mentioning the impact of COVID-19. Studies coming out from Amnesty International and others paint a grim picture. They're seeing an increase in human rights abuses worldwide as a result of the pandemic. Popular movements are less active because of lockdown, so they're not working against repressive regimes. Targets of abuse are less mobile and easier to find, and governments use the public health emergency to justify increased surveillance and other infringements on freedom and civil rights. Black, brown, and indigenous communities are hardest hit. So, one other way to advocate for human rights today is to advocate for equitable global distribution of vaccines and economic aid. Our office has been really active on this topic, so check out our website for articles, action alerts, and the webinar I mentioned earlier. We advocate for human rights because we believe they must be defended always and everywhere. We've declared them to be universal, but protecting human rights is never that straightforward. We discussed how politics often dictate what does and doesn't get addressed at the United Nations. We've seen how complicated closing Guantanamo Bay has proven. We've discussed how notions of universal human rights are expanding to include things like clean water and access to the land. And we've discussed the different ways we can advocate for vulnerable sectors such as migrants. It should be no surprise that while most leaders speak powerfully about human rights in general terms, when it comes down to it, actions are rarely as unequivocal. Let's consider a few more examples. The murder of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi is a clear example of geopolitical interests taking precedence over human rights. Whether we like it or not, Saudi Arabia is a key economic partner. So even when the Biden administration released a report saying that Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, often called MBS, directed the killing, they sanctioned multiple Saudi officials, but not MBS himself. If you want to learn more about how our elected leaders address such sticky issues, I highly recommend following the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission in the US Congress. You can sign up to receive emails from them, and they host really informative events, including a recent screening and panel discussion of the film The Dissident. It's an astonishing documentary about the Khashoggi murders. You can also find that streaming on demand. Members of Congress are also debating how to best pressure the military regime in Myanmar or Burma after the recent coup there. We've been part of lobbying meetings pressuring legislators to designate the treatment of the Rohingya minority a genocide in hopes of discouraging more atrocities. But some lawmakers fear that a genocide designation would require the U.S. to respond in ways that could create additional tensions in the region and make things worse. In this case, we think such fears are unfounded. But meanwhile, we found ourselves in a delicate situation as well. We usually advocate against economic sanctions. Too often, even so-called smart sanctions actually hurt the most vulnerable civilians while failing to pressure those in power. Iran is a case in point. But in Burma, the U.S. has been using laws such as the Global Magnitsky Act to apply truly targeted sanctions on individuals within the military junta and the firms they control. We're watching carefully, listening to activists on the ground, and so far, we've supported the sanctions in Burma. Sometimes it's not just government officials who are hesitant to act on some of these issues. It can be us ourselves. Maryknoll has a long history of mission in China, for example. Missioners are working in Hong Kong and in mainland China, teaching in universities, forming seminarians, and accompanying the church there. Usually, the whole point of our office is to advocate on the issues that impact people in the countries and communities where our missioners live and work. But we do not engage in public advocacy on issues like the democracy protests in Hong Kong, because if we did, it's likely our missioners would be forced to leave. We hope that our presence there and missioners' engagement with the people will have the greater long-term positive impact. Meanwhile, in our work in Washington, we focus on promoting cooperation that leads to more openness and stronger relations between our countries, in the hopes that this in turn will lead to a greater respect for human rights and more openness in general. We advocate cooperation on climate action and medical research. Finally, the Israel-Palestine conflict is always fraught with challenges for human rights advocates, but the situation is dire. Human Rights Watch has a powerful new study available on their website in which they make the legal case that Israeli officials are committing the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution against Palestinians. There's an excellent question and answer section as well that's worth reading. As a member of Churches for Middle East Peace, we are supporting a new bill that would forbid U.S. funds from being used by Israel to violate some of the most basic rights of Palestinians. So sometimes policymakers have a million excuses for not acting as definitively as we would like on human rights. Some of those arguments are valid, many are not. But in our advocacy work, it's always worth trying to understand them so that we can suggest practical ways around them and make progress toward our goals. Sometimes we have our own reasons for refraining from advocacy on certain pressing issues, and we must seek other forms of solidarity. I think the most important thing I can do in all these cases is to remember Dianna. First and foremost, we must stand with the victims and the survivors. Task, the organization Dianna founded for survivors, has an interview with her on its website in which they ask what advocates can do. Dianna tells us, "I would encourage ordinary people to make an effort to get to know survivors, listen to their stories, feel their grief, pain, and anguish of being separated from their homelands and families. Celebrate their daring spirit, their resilience to survive." She suggests talking to immigrants. Many people are willing to share the story of why they leave their countries. We're called, she says, to speak out against torture wherever it's practiced. We cannot be bystanders to this evil. Given everything we're living through today, I'm speaking of the refugee crisis, we need to stand in solidarity with those who are in peril and suffering. Dianna also suggests supporting groups like Task, who support survivors of human rights abuses. And finally, writing to lawmakers. I hope today you feel like you've gotten to know Dianna at least a little bit, and you'll be inspired by her example of loving solidarity to take action. Dianna Ortiz, pray for us.
Thank you so much, Dan. Well, yeah, that was a lot. And I really appreciate your highlighting Sister Dianna Ortiz, your friend, our friend.
We miss her a lot.
Yeah. And we've got some great questions coming in. First of all, the books that you mentioned, the two Orbis books, would you go ahead and say the titles again?
Yeah. The first one was The Birth of a Movement, Black Lives Matter and the Catholic Church, and it's by Olga Segura. And the other one is by James Cone, C-O-N-E, and it's called The Cross and the Lynching Tree. And both of those, I think, give a really rich sense of kind of how our faith informs our position on racism in the United States, and how we're called to be in solidarity with the movements that are struggling against it.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah.
Another question people are asking is, what is the one thing today that you would encourage people to do? What's the one action that we could do today to protect and promote human rights?
Well, I'll give you two. I mentioned some during the talk, and so one of those, I'm going to get the link and put it in the chat here. One of those was the law in the House from Betty McCollum that would make it illegal for US funds to be used by Israel in abusing the human rights of Palestinians. And so you can find that here. I'll put it in the chat on the website of Churches for Middle East Peace, of which we're a member. And that way you can reach out to your lawmakers. And the other, I will also put a link to our own website, and it is the Honduras Human Rights and Anti-Corruption Act. And so this is in memory and kind of prompted by the tragic murder of Berta Cáceres in Honduras, who was a land protector who was killed several years ago. And so there's the link to that. So that's kind of two of the difficult issues that we talked about, the Middle East and the land and water protectors, that you can take action today to help support them. So yeah, there are the links there in the chat.
Excellent, thank you. And I always like to leave us with a sign of hope, and I'm hoping you can give us an example of a human rights campaign that is a success story that people should learn more about.
Yeah, I would love to. Actually, our colleague Kathleen wrote about a great story in Maryknoll magazine, and it's a story that's outlined in a book by John Kavanagh and Robin Broad that's about water defenders in El Salvador who, after being victims of violence, they organized with the church and grassroots social movements, and they were able to actually change laws and become the first country to outlaw metal mining through their organizing efforts. So it's a real David and Goliath story, and there's a great article. I'll put a link to that in the chat as well, in the Maryknoll magazine, and that tells you all the information about the book as well, so you can read the whole story.
We stand in solidarity with our friends in El Salvador today, facing all of the threats to democracy and participation and safety for the people there. What a great story about their commitment to caring for the earth and caring for each other as water defenders.
Right.
Well, Dan, thank you so much. Thank you for your time and sharing your dear friend, Dianna. And so many of us on this webinar, I believe, had the great gift of knowing her, but you can always learn more about her and pray that Dianna continues to encourage us and inspire us. I want to leave just with repeating our website address so that we can stay connected. All of you who joined us today, you can find us at www.maryknollogc.org, and you can sign up for our email lists. You can find scripture reflections written by missioners, our newsletter, and always more action alerts like the ones that Dan mentioned. So thanks so much. It was a great half hour, and I look forward to being with you again. Thanks, Dan.